What household rule seemed reasonable until you mentioned it to your college roommate? I was telling my roommate why I couldn't go out on Friday night, explaining that I had to send my dad the weekly productivity report by midnight, or I'd lose my housing credit for the month, and Isaac stopped mid-bite of his sandwich to stare at me with this expression I couldn't quite place. My name is Levi Ashford, and I'd just told him that missing the report meant my parents would deduct $800 from my account balance, which would put me in the red and trigger a payment plan that required additional work hours to clear. Isaac put down his food very slowly and asked me to repeat what I'd just said, like he'd misheard me. So I explained it again, walking him through my family's life preparation program that I'd been part of since I was 13 years old. The system was pretty straightforward, or at least I'd always thought so. My parents owned a successful property management company called Ashford Estates, and they'd designed a comprehensive program to teach me and my younger sister about real-world financial responsibility and work ethic. Starting at age 13, we were required to pay rent for our rooms, cover our food costs, and contribute to household utilities. We earned money by working for the family business doing various tasks like property maintenance, administrative work, client communications, and project management. My parents tracked everything in a detailed accounting system, and we received monthly statements showing our earnings, expenses, and account balances. If we went into debt, we had to work extra hours to clear it. If we refused to work or missed deadlines, we faced financial penalties that compounded until we corrected the behavior. It was designed to simulate real adult life in a controlled environment where mistakes had consequences, but we still had parental guidance. Isaac's face had gone completely pale while I was explaining this, and he asked how much I'd paid my parents over the years. I pulled up the spreadsheet on my laptop and showed him the running total, which came out to roughly $68,000 since I turned 13. That included room and board at $900 per month, food costs at approximately $300 per month, utilities at $150 per month, and various other fees for things like laundry service, internet access, and transportation. Isaac's hands were shaking as he looked at the numbers, and he asked how much my parents had paid me for the work I'd done. I showed him that section too, where my hourly wage was listed at $7 per hour for standard tasks and up to $12 for specialized work. He did some quick math on his phone and then asked very carefully whether I understood that I'd essentially paid my parents to work for them. I tried to explain that it wasn't like that the program was about learning financial literacy and understanding the true cost of living. My parents had always framed it as a gift, a way to prepare me for independence so I wouldn't be shocked by real-world expenses when I moved out. They'd seen too many young adults fail because they'd been sheltered from financial realities, and they were determined that their children would understand money, work, and responsibility from an early age. My father, Richard Ashford, had built his property management empire from nothing and attributed his success to understanding the value of a dollar and the importance of hard work. My mother, Caroline Ashford, had a background in finance and believed that children needed practical experience with budgeting, earning, and managing debt to develop into functional adults. Together, they'd created this program that they insisted would give us advantages other kids didn't have. Isaac stood up and said he needed to talk to someone about this, and he left our dorm room so quickly I thought I'd somehow offended him. I sat there confused, reviewing the conversation in my head, trying to figure out what I'd said wrong. The life preparation program had been such a fundamental part of my life for 5 years that explaining it felt as natural as describing what I ate for breakfast. I'd never questioned it because my parents had always presented it as normal, as what responsible parents did to properly prepare their children. They'd emphasized how lucky I was to have parents who cared enough to teach me these lessons early, who invested time in tracking my finances and providing real-world experience. Most parents, they said, were too lazy or too sentimental to properly prepare their kids, and those kids ended up struggling as adults. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. Isaac came back 30 minutes later with our RA, a graduate student named Theo Constantinou, who asked if he could ask me some questions about my living situation at home. I agreed, and he sat down with a notepad and started asking for details about the life preparation program from the beginning. I walked him through how it started when I turned 13, with my parents sitting me down for a serious conversation about growing up and taking responsibility. They'd explained that childhood was ending, and it was time to learn how the real world operated. They presented me with a contract that outlined my new financial obligations and the work opportunities available to earn money to cover those obligations. The contract was 10 pages long and covered everything from room rental rates to penalty structures for missed work shifts to the appeals process if I felt a charge was unfair. Theo asked if I'd had a choice about signing the contract, and I explained that technically yes, but my parents had made it clear that refusing would mean losing privileges like internet access, participation in family activities, and their financial support for things like school supplies or extracurriculars. They'd framed it as a choice between being part of the family's commitment to excellence or being left to struggle on my own. At 13, that hadn't felt like much of a choice, so I'd signed. My parents had both signed as witnesses and had the document notarized by a family friend who was a lawyer. They'd given me a copy for my records and told me to keep it somewhere safe because it was an important legal document that governed our relationship going forward. Theo's pen had stopped moving, and he asked what kind of work I'd done for the family business over the years. I listed everything, starting with basic tasks at 13 like filing documents, answering phones, and data entry, then progressing to more complex work as I got older. By 15, I was managing tenant communications, processing maintenance requests, and coordinating with contractors. By 16, I was doing property inspections, handling move-in and move-out procedures, and managing the company's social media presence. At 17, I was preparing financial reports, managing vendor relationships, and training new employees that my parents hired for the business. I typically worked 20 to 30 hours per week during the school year and 40 to 50 hours per week during summers, all while maintaining my academic performance because poor grades triggered financial penalties. Theo asked how my parents enforced the work requirements if I refused or didn't meet their standards, and I explained the penalty system in detail. Missing a scheduled work shift resulted in a $50 fine, plus the loss of that shift's earnings. Substandard work that required correction resulted in unpaid remedial hours until the work met quality standards. Missing a deadline for reports or deliverables resulted in escalating fines that doubled for each day of delay. Accumulating too much debt triggered mandatory additional work hours on weekends, and sustained poor performance could result in loss of room access, where I'd have to sleep in the basement office area until my account balanced. My parents had implemented these consequences progressively, starting with warnings and minor penalties and escalating to more severe measures when I didn't meet their expectations. Theo's hands were shaking as he wrote this down, and he asked if my younger sister was in the same program. I confirmed that Natalie had entered the life preparation program when she turned 13, about 2 years after me. She was 15 now and still at home, still working and paying her way according to the same contract structure I'd had. Theo asked if I'd ever told teachers or counselors about this arrangement, and I realized I'd been carefully trained not to. My parents had explained that outsiders wouldn't understand our family's commitment to preparing children properly, that people would judge us for being different, that it was a private family matter that didn't concern anyone else. They'd emphasized that discussing family finances with outsiders was inappropriate and could cause problems for the business if clients or competitors learned details about our operations. Theo set down his pen and told me directly that what I'd just described wasn't a life preparation program or financial literacy training. It was child labor exploitation, and depending on the specific details, it might constitute human trafficking, wage theft, and child abuse. I laughed nervously and said that couldn't be right, that my parents were successful business owners who followed all the laws and regulations. They'd always emphasized legal compliance and proper documentation. Theo asked if I'd ever received actual paychecks with tax withholdings, and I realized I hadn't. All the money was tracked in their internal accounting system, but I'd never received a W-2 or had taxes withheld. My parents had explained that because it was a family business, and I was a minor, the arrangement was handled differently than standard employment. Theo told me he was required to report what I'd described to campus police and potentially to state labor authorities, because what I'd described involved a minor still in the situation. I insisted it wasn't abuse, that my parents loved us and were just trying to teach us important lessons about money and work. He asked me if I knew anyone else whose parents had charged them rent starting at age 13 or required them to work 30 hours a week while maintaining school performance. I admitted I didn't, but I'd assumed other families just had different methods of teaching the same lessons. Theo explained that parents are legally required to provide housing, food, and basic necessities to their minor children without charging them, and that requiring excessive work from children while paying below minimum wage violated child labor laws. He made a phone call while I sat there trying to process what he was saying, trying to reconcile 5 years of believing this was normal with the horror in his voice as he described the situation to whoever was on the other end. Campus police arrived within 40 minutes, 2 officers who introduced themselves as Lieutenant Felix Ramos and Officer Ainsley Cooper. They asked me to describe the life preparation program again from the beginning, and this time I started to hear how it sounded saying it out loud to strangers who kept exchanging glances. Lieutenant Ramos asked if I had documentation of the arrangement, and I showed them everything on my laptop. The contract I'd signed at 13, the monthly financial statements showing 5 years of charges and earnings, the detailed work logs showing thousands of hours I'd worked, the productivity reports I'd submitted every week for years. Officer Cooper asked if I'd be willing to provide copies of these documents for their investigation, and I agreed, not fully understanding yet what investigation meant or what it would lead to. Lieutenant Ramos asked about my sister Natalie, whether she was safe, whether I'd be willing to contact her to check on her welfare. I called Natalie's cell phone and she answered in a whisper, asking what was wrong. I asked where she was, and she said she was finishing inventory work in one of the rental properties because she'd missed her quota earlier in the week and had to make up hours. It was almost 11 at night on a Friday. She was 15 years old. I told her to go home immediately and not tell our parents I'd called, that something was happening and I needed her to be somewhere safe. Natalie's voice got tense, and she asked what I'd done, if I'd screwed something up that was going to cause problems for the family. I realized she had the same conditioned fear response I'd had, the automatic assumption that any deviation from the program meant consequences. I told her that the program might not be legal, that I'd described it to people at school, and they'd reacted very differently than I'd expected. She was quiet for a long moment, and then asked if she was going to get in trouble for not meeting her hours this week. I told her no, that she might not have to work for Mom and Dad anymore at all, that this might be over. She started crying and said she didn't know if she wanted it to be over because at least she understood the rules of the program, and she didn't know what would happen if everything changed. Officer Cooper was already on her phone coordinating with local police in my hometown, requesting a welfare check on Natalie and evidence preservation at my parents' business office and home. I gave them the addresses and watched as they mobilized resources to investigate my family. Lieutenant Ramos asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed by detectives who specialized in labor exploitation and financial crimes, and I said yes, still not fully grasping the magnitude of what I'd set in motion by casually mentioning my productivity report to Isaac. Within 3 hours, I was sitting across from Detective Nora Blackwell, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes who'd seen 22 years investigating white-collar crime and exploitation. Detective Blackwell asked me to start from the very beginning and explain every detail I could remember about the Life Preparation Program's implementation and operation. I described the initial contract meeting when I was 13, how my parents had presented it as a mature responsibility and an opportunity to learn real skills. I described the first time I'd received a monthly statement and seen that I owed my parents money, how strange that had felt, but how they'd explained it was normal to start adult life in debt and work your way out. I described the first time I'd been penalized for missing work, how I'd cried, and my father had told me tears didn't pay bills, that I needed to develop emotional resilience alongside financial discipline. The detective asked about the hardest periods, and I described the summer when I was 15 and had accumulated significant debt after getting sick and missing 2 weeks of work. My parents had charged me for the missed shifts, plus medical costs for the doctor visit, and I'd ended up owing them almost $3,000. They'd required me to work 60-hour weeks for a month to clear the debt, which meant I'd had almost no free time and had been exhausted constantly. When I'd complained, my father had explained that this was exactly what happened in the real world when you couldn't work and lost income, that I was learning a crucial lesson about the importance of health and financial reserves. Detective Blackwell asked if I'd ever tried to refuse the arrangement or run away, and I admitted I'd thought about it but had nowhere to go and no money of my own, since everything I earned went straight into the program accounts. My parents had explained that the money I earned was being held in trust for my future, that once I turned 18 and completed the program successfully, I'd have access to accumulated funds that would help me start adult life. They'd framed it as forced savings that would benefit me later. The detective asked if I had any documentation showing these trust accounts or savings, and I realized I didn't. I just trusted my parents' explanation that the money was being held for me. She made notes about that and asked about my sister's situation specifically, what work she'd been doing and whether she'd shown any signs of physical or psychological harm. I described how Natalie had become increasingly anxious over the past year, developing nervous habits like pulling her hair and biting her nails until they bled. She'd started having panic attacks when she made mistakes or didn't meet quotas, and my parents had responded by adding stress management to her required skills training. They'd given her books about performance under pressure and required her to write reports about managing anxiety in professional settings. It hadn't occurred to me until this moment that maybe her anxiety was caused by the program itself, not by her failure to properly manage stress. Detective Blackwell's expression darkened, and she asked if I'd be willing to be examined by a psychologist to assess the long-term impact of the program. I agreed, and she arranged for me to meet with Dr. Julian Worth, a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma and coercive control. Dr. Worth asked me to describe a typical day during the program, and I walked him through the rigid schedule I'd maintained for years. Wake at 6, productivity journaling before breakfast, school from 8 to 3, work for the family business from 4 to 8 or 9, homework until 11, sleep, repeat. Weekends were primarily work days with 8 to 12-hour shifts, depending on business needs and my account balance. Dr. Worth asked what I did for fun or relaxation, and I had to think about it. My parents had viewed recreational activities as privileges that needed to be earned through strong performance. If my productivity metrics were good and my account was balanced, I could have limited free time on Sunday afternoons. But that time often got absorbed by catch-up work or studying because poor academic performance triggered additional work requirements to compensate for the future earning potential I was jeopardizing. Dr. Worth asked if I'd had friends or social relationships, and I realized most of my friendships had faded over the years because I'd never had time to socialize. My parents had explained that successful people prioritize productivity over social activities, that meaningful relationships would come later once I'd established myself professionally. The psychologist asked about my relationship with my parents, whether I felt loved and supported, and I had trouble answering. I knew they believed they were helping me, that everything they'd done was framed as preparation and care, but I couldn't remember the last time they'd told me they were proud of me without qualifying it with areas for improvement. I couldn't remember them asking how I felt or what I wanted separate from the program's requirements. Every interaction had been filtered through productivity metrics and financial performance. Dr. Worth explained that what I was describing was a form of conditional love based on economic output, which was psychologically damaging and indicated severe emotional neglect alongside the labor exploitation. Back in my hometown, police had executed a search warrant on my parents' business office and home, seizing computers, financial records, and documents related to the life preparation program. Detective Blackwell called to tell me they'd found extensive documentation of everything I'd described. My parents had kept meticulous records of every hour I'd worked, every charge they'd assessed, every penalty they'd imposed. They'd created a complete accounting system that tracked 5 years of my labor and 2 years of Natalie's. The detective said the records would make prosecution straightforward because my parents had essentially documented their own crimes while believing they were running a legitimate family program. They'd also found the supposed trust accounts where my earnings were being saved, and Detective Blackwell's voice got tight when she told me the accounts didn't exist. All the money I'd earned had gone directly into my parents' business operating accounts. They'd used my labor to reduce staffing costs while charging me for the privilege of living in their home. The $68,000 I'd paid them over 5 years had funded their lifestyle and business expenses. There was no college fund, no savings being held for my benefit, no accumulated resources to help me start adult life. It had all been a lie designed to keep me working without questioning the arrangement. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I felt something crack inside my chest when she told me that. A fundamental trust that I'd built my entire adolescence on. My parents hadn't just exploited my labor, they'd convinced me to participate enthusiastically in my own exploitation by promising a future payoff that had never existed. They'd trained me to view their abuse as love, their theft as generosity, their control as preparation. Detective Blackwell asked if I was okay, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, that everything I'd believed about my family and my upbringing was reorganizing itself into something ugly that I didn't recognize. Natalie had been placed in emergency foster care with a family friend named Rebecca Torres while Child Protective Services investigated. I talked to her on the phone that night and she was cycling between relief and terror. Relief that she didn't have to work tomorrow, terror that our parents would be furious and she'd face severe consequences when this was all over. I had to explain to her that it was over, that Mom and Dad couldn't enforce the program anymore, that what they'd done was illegal and they were facing criminal charges. She asked what would happen to her, where she'd live, and I told her CPS was working on finding appropriate placement, but that she was safe now and didn't have to earn her safety anymore. My parents' attorney, a lawyer named Gerald Nash, reached out requesting I recant my statements and clarify that I'd misrepresented the family program to authorities. I forwarded his email to Detective Blackwell, who responded on my behalf that I wouldn't be communicating with my parents or their legal representatives except through official channels. My parents themselves sent multiple messages, alternating between fury that I'd betrayed the family and appeals to my loyalty, asking me to fix the misunderstanding I'd created. I blocked their numbers after the 5th message because each one made me feel like I was drowning in guilt and obligation, despite knowing objectively that they'd abused me. The case attracted media attention when it came out that a prominent property management company owner had been using her own children as unpaid labor while charging them rent. A journalist named Quinn Alvarez from the local newspaper wrote a series of articles about the case, interviewing child labor law experts who explained that what my parents had done violated multiple state and federal regulations. The minimum wage in our state had been $10.25 during the years I'd worked, but my parents had paid me $7 per hour and often less. They'd required me to work hours that exceeded legal limits for minors. They'd created hazardous working conditions by having me do property maintenance without proper training or safety equipment, and they'd done all of this while charging me for basic necessities that parents are legally required to provide freely. Quinn interviewed me for one of the articles, and I described the psychological impact of growing up believing love was transactional and safety needed to be purchased through perfect performance. I explained how I'd developed severe anxiety around making mistakes or failing to meet expectations because the consequences had been immediate and financial, how I'd learned to view my own worth in terms of productivity metrics, how I'd lost years of childhood to work that had benefited my parents while they'd convinced me it was benefiting me. The article went viral and sparked national conversations about extreme parenting methods and the line between teaching responsibility and exploitation. Other families came forward with similar stories after the article published. Parents who'd charged their children rent or required excessive work in family businesses while calling it character building. Quinn wrote follow-up pieces examining the trend of parents who'd weaponized financial literacy and work ethic rhetoric to justify exploiting their children's labor. She interviewed sociologists who explained that these cases represented a dark intersection of helicopter parenting, hustle culture, and economic anxiety, where parents projected their fears about their children's future success into abusive control systems disguised as preparation. My parents were arrested and charged with multiple counts of child labor law violations, wage theft, fraud, and child endangerment. The prosecutor was an assistant district attorney named Simone Kaplan, who specialized in economic crimes and human trafficking. She explained that while many people associated trafficking with sex work, labor trafficking was equally serious, and my case met several definitional criteria. My parents had recruited me into work through false promises, had controlled my labor through a combination of debt and threats, and had exploited that labor for commercial benefit. The fact that they were my parents didn't exempt them from trafficking statutes when they'd used fraud and coercion to extract labor from a minor. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the discovery that my parents had done this before. Detective Blackwell found records showing they'd employed several teenage workers in their business over the years, always paying below minimum wage and always under informal arrangements that avoided official employment documentation. Some of those former workers came forward during the investigation, describing similar experiences of being paid poorly while being told they were lucky to get valuable real-world experience. None of them had been subjected to the full life preparation program like me and Natalie, but the pattern of exploitation was clear. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and I testified for an entire day describing the program in detail. Simone Kaplan walked me through the contract I'd signed at 13, asking if I'd understood what I was agreeing to. I explained that I'd been 13, and my parents had presented it as non-negotiable, that I'd trusted their explanation that this was normal and necessary. She presented the financial records showing $68,000 I'd paid my parents, then showed the bank records proving none of that money had been saved for me. She brought in expert witnesses who testified about minimum wage violations, excessive work hours, and the psychological impact of conditioning parental love on economic productivity. The defense attorney tried to argue that my parents had acted within their rights as parents to require chores and teach financial responsibility, that the arrangement was voluntary and educational. Judge Raymond Flores shut that down repeatedly, pointing out that there's a legal difference between age-appropriate chores and 30 hours of weekly labor in a commercial enterprise. That charging a 13-year-old $900 per month in rent isn't teaching budgeting, it's extortion. That paying below minimum wage while requiring work isn't job training, it's wage theft regardless of the family relationship. Natalie testified reluctantly, describing her experience in the program and the toll it had taken on her mental health. She was still deeply conflicted about testifying against our parents, still partially convinced that they'd meant well even if their methods had been wrong. But when Simone Kaplan asked her directly if she'd wanted to work 30-hour weeks at age 13, if she'd wanted to pay rent to live in her childhood home, if she'd wanted to sleep in a basement when her account went negative, Natalie broke down crying and admitted she'd been terrified and exhausted for 2 years straight. She said she'd wished constantly that her life could be like her friends' lives, where they got to be kids without tracking every expense and maximizing every hour. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. My parents were sentenced to 6 years in prison for the labor violations and fraud, followed by probation. They were ordered to pay restitution of $137,000, covering the wages they'd failed to pay me and Natalie at minimum wage, plus damages. Judge Flores' sentencing statement was devastating, describing how my parents had perverted natural parental authority into systematic exploitation, had betrayed their duty to nurture and protect their children, had damaged us psychologically and stolen years of our childhood while convincing us to thank them for it. The courtroom was filled with media and community members who'd followed the case. Several former employees of Ashford Estates were present, and I heard one of them whisper that she'd always thought something was off about how the Ashfords ran their business, but had never imagined they were doing the same thing to their own kids. My parents were let out in handcuffs while my mother cried, and my father maintained his rigid conviction that they'd been misunderstood by a system that didn't appreciate their level of commitment to their children's success. Ashford Estates collapsed within months. The labor violations investigation revealed that my parents had been cutting corners in their property management operations, using exploited labor to maintain profit margins while providing substandard service. Clients fled when the abuse case went public, and the business eventually filed for bankruptcy. The properties my parents had managed were transferred to other companies, and the Ashford Estates name became synonymous with exploitation and fraud. Natalie stayed with Rebecca Torres through the end of the school year, slowly learning that she didn't need to earn meals or prove her worth to deserve basic care. Rebecca told me that Natalie would sometimes ask what she needed to do to pay for dinner, and Rebecca would gently remind her that children don't pay for food, that she was welcome and wanted without conditions. Natalie started therapy with a psychologist named Dr. Iris Lambert, who specialized in childhood trauma, working through the belief systems the program had instilled. Dr. Lambert explained that Natalie had developed a transactional understanding of relationships where everything was an exchange and nothing was freely given, and that rewiring those beliefs would take years of consistent evidence that she was valued regardless of productivity. My own therapy happened at the University Counseling Center with Dr. Amara Singh, who helped me identify the ways the program had shaped my thinking about work, worth, and relationships. I'd developed a compulsive need to prove my value through productivity, experiencing guilt and anxiety whenever I relaxed or did something purely for enjoyment. Dr. Singh explained that my parents had essentially trained me to be a perfect employee at the cost of being a healthy human, and that recovery meant learning to separate my intrinsic worth from my economic output. She taught me that rest wasn't laziness, that mistakes didn't require financial penance, that I could exist and be valued without constantly performing. The work was harder than I'd expected because the program's logic was so deeply embedded in how I thought. When I did poorly on an exam, my first thought was calculating the financial penalty that would be assessed, even though I wasn't in the program anymore. When I wanted to buy something, I'd mentally check if my productivity that week justified the expense, even though I was spending my own money from a campus job that paid me legally. Dr. Singh helped me recognize these automatic thoughts and actively challenge them, but the conditioning fought back hard, insisting that the program's logic was reality and anything else was dangerous delusion. I changed my major from business to social work, deciding I wanted to help other people who'd been exploited by systems that presented abuse as care. My experience gave me insights that academic training alone couldn't provide. I understood the psychology of being convinced to participate in your own exploitation, the complex loyalty to abusers who'd framed their abuse as love, the difficulty of reconstructing identity when your entire worldview had been shaped by a system designed to extract value from you. Isaac remained my friend throughout everything, supportive, but careful not to push me to process faster than I was ready. He told me months later that he'd known something was deeply wrong the moment I'd mentioned paying rent at 13, but he'd been afraid of how I'd react if he'd confronted me too directly. He'd chosen to get authority figures involved immediately because he'd recognized I wouldn't believe the program was abusive if it just came from him. I thanked him for that, for caring enough to act even when it meant blowing up my family and forcing me to see truths I'd spent 5 years avoiding. Natalie graduated high school with Rebecca's support and got accepted to college with scholarships that covered most of her costs. She called me before making her decision, asking if I thought she deserved to go to college when she hadn't earned it through the program. I told her the program had been a lie, that she deserved education and opportunities just for existing as a human with potential. She cried and said she was trying to believe that, but it felt wrong, felt unearned. I told her that feeling would fade eventually, that we'd both been programmed to believe our worth needed purchase prices, and deprogramming took time. My parents served 4 years before being released on parole. Their parole officer contacted me to see if I wanted information about their release location, and I said yes, but didn't want direct contact. They'd moved to a different state, unable to handle the stigma in their hometown where everyone knew them as the couple who'd enslaved their children while running a property management business. They sent a letter through their parole officer requesting a meeting to apologize and attempt reconciliation. I discussed it with Dr. Singh, and we decided I wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that. The letter they'd sent included therapeutic language about recognizing the harm they'd caused and taking responsibility for their actions. But it also included justifications about their intentions being good and their methods being misguided rather than malicious. Reading it made me angry because they still couldn't fully admit what they'd done, still needed to frame their abuse as a well-intentioned mistake rather than deliberate exploitation. Dr. Singh helped me understand that my parents might never be capable of the full accountability I needed, and that my healing couldn't depend on them providing something they didn't have. I graduated with my social work degree and got hired by a nonprofit called Freedom House that specialized in labor trafficking recovery. My first client was a 17-year-old named Lucas Brennan who'd been working in his uncle's restaurant since age 12, living in a storage room and being paid nothing while being told he was learning the business and earning his keep. When he described his situation in our first session, I recognized the same confusion I'd had, the inability to see his exploitation as exploitation because it had been framed as family and opportunity. I worked with Lucas for 8 months, helping him understand that family doesn't require children to work without wages, that businesses that can't afford to pay workers legally can't afford to operate, that his labor had value regardless of whether his uncle recognized it. We worked on deprogramming the belief that he owed his uncle gratitude for the opportunity to be exploited. Lucas eventually testified in the case against his uncle, and the restaurant was shut down for labor violations. Lucas got placed in a foster home and started catching up on the education he'd missed while working 70-hour weeks. 10 years after that first conversation with Isaac, I was supervising a team of social workers at Freedom House and consulting on policy reform to improve identification and prosecution of familial labor trafficking. Quinn Alvarez interviewed me again for an anniversary piece about my case and its long-term impact. I talked about how the experience had shaped my career, but no longer defined my worth, how I'd learned to build a life motivated by genuine values rather than fear of financial penalties, how I'd developed relationships based on mutual care rather than transactional exchange. The chronic anxiety I'd developed during the program still surfaced during stressful periods, my body remembering the constant vigilance of tracking productivity and avoiding penalties. But I'd learned coping strategies that helped me remember I was safe now, that mistakes didn't cascade into catastrophic consequences, that my value wasn't measured in dollars per hour. Dr. Singh and I had worked together for 6 years before I'd graduated from therapy, and she'd helped me reconstruct an identity that wasn't based on being the perfect worker my parents had tried to create. Natalie became a labor rights attorney, using her law degree to advocate for workers experiencing exploitation and abuse. We talked monthly, comparing notes on recovery and supporting each other through triggers and setbacks. Neither of us had contact with our parents, having decided independently that protecting our hard-won peace was more important than fulfilling their hopes for reconciliation. We'd spent our adolescence subjected to their version of love, and we'd earned the right to define love for ourselves now. I never got the $68,000 back that I'd paid them during the program years. The restitution my parents were ordered to pay had been prioritized for the wage theft, and their bankruptcy meant the full amount would probably never be recovered. But I'd built a life and career that had nothing to do with money they'd stolen and everything to do with the resilience I'd developed despite their abuse. That felt like better justice than any dollar amount they could pay. When people ask me now about my childhood, I told them the truth without shame or hesitation. My parents had run a labor exploitation scheme disguised as a life preparation program, had charged me rent starting at 13 while paying me below minimum wage to work in their business, had stolen my adolescence while convincing me I was lucky for the education. The looks of horror I got in response used to make me defensive, used to make me want to explain that my parents had meant well. Now those looks just confirmed that my reality had finally aligned with actual reality, that I could trust my perceptions and my anger. The life preparation program hadn't prepared me for life. It had prepared me to be exploited, to accept abuse as normal, to mistake control for care. What actually prepared me for life was everything that came after. Learning I deserved protection, finding people who offered help without conditions, building identity separate from productivity, choosing purpose over programming. That was the real preparation, the real education, the real freedom. If I could go back and talk to 18-year-old me sitting in that dorm room casually mentioning his productivity report to Isaac, I'd tell him that everything was about to change in ways that would hurt before they helped, that discovering the truth would feel like losing his family and his entire understanding of childhood, but that grief was necessary to clear space for reality, that the pain of dismantling the program's lies would eventually give way to relief at not having to live under those lies anymore. I'd tell him that Isaac's horror was the appropriate response, that everyone's shock and concern was evidence that the program had never been normal, had never been love, had always been abuse no matter how carefully it was documented or how earnestly it was framed as preparation. I'd tell him to trust the people who reacted with alarm rather than the parents who'd taught him to dismiss alarm as misunderstanding. I'd tell him recovery was possible, that he'd survive the destruction of everything he'd believed, that he'd build something real from the pieces. But mostly, I'd tell him that he'd done the right thing by telling Isaac about the productivity report, by answering Theo's questions honestly, by cooperating with the investigation, even though it felt like betrayal. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is tell the truth about what happened to you and let other people show you how to see it clearly. Sometimes love looks like someone being horrified on your behalf when you've been trained not to be horrified for yourself. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.